everything that surrounds us constitute the environment. Environment constitute non-living and living things. This environment possesses the self-cleaning capacity and things when introduced beyond this self-cleaning capacity, we say the environment is polluted or contaminated. This environment problem, degradation, is now becoming a global problem, and this state has reached to a level when our own survival is threatened. To discuss the causes for this environmental pollution, to see what toxicity they cause to the biosystems including man, and what control measures can be adopted to control it, we have with us today two eminent scientists from UK, Dr. S. Frost, Senior Lecturer, Natural Resource Unit, Salford University, Salford, England, Dr. Gilton, Department of Surveying, Salford University, Salford, England. I would like to start with Dr. Frost. It is normally said that the economic, agricultural, and industrial activities, they are major sources for the environmental toxicity or the pollution. Can we afford to think of agricultural, economic, and industrial development without toxicity?
We ought to be able to afford to be able to do that, but unfortunately we're living in a world where there's an enormous build-up of toxic materials within the environment. We are affected in our day-to-day lives by all kinds of heavy metals and pesticides and other materials that have been produced over the last few generations, which are causing all kinds of biological effects within the systems within which we function. So, with regard to the future, although we all aspire to economic development and industrial improvement and agricultural productivity, we have to recognise that inevitably there will be an increasing risk of toxicity arising from these various activities.
A number of toxins, toxic substances are emitted due to these activities. Can you narrate or give some of the toxins whose effect are immense as far as the toxicity is concerned from the point of view of the human welfare?
I've mentioned heavy metals. These substances have been around for many thousands of years, and wherever you have mining activity, there's always the risk that there's going to be some exposure to heavy metal contamination. What of course is more significant for us at the moment is the incidence of synthetic substances which have been produced by industry and which have been released into the environment for agricultural purposes or for the control of disease. And of course these are the pesticides.
And from the point of view of genetics and the carcinogenic effect?
Well, there's always the risk that many of these substances will have an effect individually on the chromosome structure and the genetics of organisms. And although we understand to some extent how these are affected, there's an awful lot we don't know. We don't know how different substances, when they're mixed with other substances, will affect the chromosome structure.
Whether there exists some correlation between these toxins with that of the food chain and the food web?
There are distinct changes in organisms and their relationships with one another. And if we think of organisms comprising a food chain, where one group of organisms will depend upon another group of organisms in order for them to survive, they need to feed, we need to recognise that the behaviour of these different organisms will be affected by toxins, The physiology of the organisms will be affected with regard to their respiration rate, their ability to respire. Their reproductive capacity might well be affected. If they lay eggs, then it's quite likely that the hatchability of the eggs will be affected, and therefore the whole productivity, the growth rate of organisms at different levels in the food chain are quite likely to be influenced by this toxic material that we're exposed to.
Is it possible for us to measure the level of toxicity in the living systems?
A lot of work has been done on this, and measurements are taken when we know what particular substance to look for. So the heavy metals, for instance, lead, cadmium, mercury, and other substances like that are fairly easy to be recognised from a chemical point of view. But of course many organic substances which also have a toxic effect are perhaps more difficult to locate. And we also have to recognise that there is a change in structure often during the time that they're in the environment, these substances being affected by environmental parameters.
A lot of work, you must be knowing that, you know it very well, that a lot of work is being done to measure the toxicity, to assess the toxicity level in different organisms. In any way, this sort of work is going to help us in controlling this menace.
By knowing the scale of the effect, then we are in a position to determine what action is necessary. Monitoring is vitally important with regard to being able to make management decisions which would enable us to influence change. And we need to make changes with regard to the discharges of these toxic materials and their production within industry or within the
What
market.
actually I wanted to emphasize is that these toxicity studies in any way can help us in finding out the control for environmental pollution.
These toxicity studies will give us information as to how these toxins, these substances, influence organisms. In that way, we can hopefully provide information for the people who make legislation to determine what limits are acceptable in particular circumstances. They will then hopefully create a legislative structure which will impose constraint on people's exposure.
For the purpose of toxicity studies, mostly the scientists and the researchers, they are using fish as an experimental animal, insect as an experimental animal, and in most cases even the rat. Whether the studies conducted on these experimental animals, can we accept them that they will be applicable to the man as well? Or what will be the correlation between our health and the studies conducted on these insects, fish or the rat?
It's important to recognise that toxicity is an interdisciplinary, or toxicology is an interdisciplinary subject area. So it's important for the biologist in the laboratory to liaise directly with the medical profession. The experiments that are done in laboratories obviously have some value in indicating the levels at which particular organisms are susceptible to particular levels of heavy metal or pesticide or other toxic material. But they only give an indication, and it should lead on to other investigations with regard to people. And this, of course, can only be done by liaison with the medical profession. So I would hope that in the future that there would be much more opportunity for the collation of research results to derive from animal experiments and related much more directly to the effects that are being shared by small children, adults and the elderly within any community when they're exposed to contamination of atmosphere or drinking water or the land within which they have to grow food.
Dr. Galton, you are basically an architect. People also say that urbanization is also one of the reasons which is putting pressures on the land and the environment. And in this urbanization process, construction of buildings there, material for construction used that is utilized? Do you feel that construction of building or the building material used in any way can cause toxicity?
Yes, clearly as we respond to that increasing population with the quantity of building, we are taking up more and more land, and the quantity of waste products from building are of course for concern. We're also concerned about the nature of the new materials which we use in buildings, which have been seen in some cases to cause some problems. And also in terms of the form of buildings and our requirement for higher and higher standards within the space we enclose, so that we require more energy to service those buildings.
Say for example, we are going up and up and up as far as the construction is concerned. Does it have some effect on the toxicity or the environment?
Well, it has some effect because tall buildings are very expensive in energy resource, both in terms of their construction, because the nature of the technology to construct the buildings requires materials which use a lot of embodied energy. That is the energy required to win the materials and transform them into working building materials and place them in position for these tall buildings. Furthermore, that to service that tall building, for us to move around the building, to travel up to the high parts of the building, require mechanical assistance, and that is expensive on energy as well. And all these energies are produced usually at power stations of whatever form, and the output of those power stations are cause for concern, so that it is a chain reaction from the building to the various
This building material used in any way that also causes some toxicity to man?
Oh yes, we have experienced...
The people living in those buildings?
Yes, we have what is known as sick building syndrome, which is a problem with people working and living in some buildings who feel fairly constantly ill. And that has been traced to some gases coming off from the plastics and other new materials which we've been using in buildings. It has also come from the form of buildings, that we now service and condition our buildings with air conditioning, and consequently what happens, we seal them, and so the gases get sealed in the buildings.
From your own study, because you have conducted some work, you have done some work with these building material.
Indeed.
What building material you feel is most injurious to the human health?
I don't think we can say that any one material is injurious to human health. What we have found is a combination of materials which in glues and in plastics, and indeed in Europe now paints of the oil-based and chemical-based paints have been shown in time to give this gas off. So that what we are doing in Europe is, it is the architect's responsibility to start specifying materials which don't have those qualities.
Is it really a cause of concern in UK?
Yes, indeed.
To
Yes.
what extent?
To the extent that there are major research projects, and I'm involved with supervising some, in terms of the understanding what precisely is causing the illness of people in these buildings. And we have demolished buildings because in some cases we have been unable to identify precisely the causes of the illness which has struck a large percentage of the inhabitants of that building.
Now the toxicity which these materials they are causing to the man,
Yes.
is there any relationship with the physiology of the body? What they cause, some diseases or some problems, ailments arising in the man due to the use of these building materials or living in such material, with such materials?
The evidence we have at the moment is that there is a physiological effect. We rely as architects and building engineers on the medical scientists and the toxicologists to advise us. So this is a problem which involves a multidisciplinary approach to resolve and understand the problem. We also need to involve the services engineers who are designing the service systems and it requires thinking in terms of how we service the buildings. We also have found in the UK that we have a natural occurring problems of radon gas, which is a naturally occurring gas that comes from granite rock. And now that we are sealing our buildings to a greater extent than we did in the past, that gas is collecting in our buildings and is now causing us cause for concern. So we are now having to develop new technologies to produce natural ventilation in our buildings, which in past times was there naturally in the form of the buildings that we produced.
Can you give some examples of the technologies you are developing to overcome this problem?
We're looking in two directions. One group of people are looking at technologies of ventilation that draw the air out or put pressure onto the building to push the air out through the natural resources. Another group, of which I'm a member, suggests that what we need to do is to look at our historic architecture and the ways in which our forefathers designed buildings and produce ventilation and produce the conditions within the building by natural systems, by using the natural ventilation and environmental mechanisms.
It means you wanted us to go back again 50 years back, is it so?
Well, maybe longer than that. It may be further than 50 years, but we want to understand how they work and then use the principles in modern buildings. So we're not looking to move back to reproduce the buildings of historic times, but to understand the concepts of the buildings of historic times and to apply them in a modern context.
Dr. Frost, please give some message to our people how to control this environmental pollution, keeping in view in particular that ours is a developing country and we cannot afford to lose development. What message would you like to give to our viewer?
You can't afford to lose development, but equally the professionals amongst you have the responsibility to share the information that you have, to make sure that everyone is aware of the situation within which they're living and assist them with all the technologies and measures that you have at your disposal to ensure that they live a protected life in a clean and improving environment. Hopefully in that way everyone will gradually achieve a much better standard of living.
Dr. Frost has also given us a message that the people can play a bigger role if really we wish to control the environmental problem, the toxicity problem, and if the society is fully aware, certainly society can create pressure groups, and these pressure groups will certainly go a long way in helping us and the government to control the environmental pollution. I thank you, both of you, for coming.